Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was a box office failure, to put it simply. But regardless, it penetrated the minds of nerds everywhere, myself included, like a subspace highway being run through their heads. 13 years later, it's pretty easy to look back on it with rose-tinted glasses, but after reading the original comics, I feel like the silver screen adaptation leaves just a little bit to be desired. To sum it up, Scott Pilgrim needs to be an asshole. Like most adaptations for the big screen, Edgar Wright's interpretation of O'Malley's original comics drops a lot of the nuance for the sake of cinema. Why are Scott and Ramona kind of different? Why is Negascott just played off as a pointless gag at the end of the movie? Speaking of the end of the movie, why does it not quite feel right? I would say all these things boil down to really one core problem. And that is just Scott is too f***ing likable on camera. So let's dive into Edgar Wright's nerd cult classic and see where O'Malley's source material tackles some ideas a little bit better than the movie does. Well, the casting of Michael Cera is probably the right place to start. Back when he was cast, it drew a lot of criticism because he's got a reputation for playing the same motherfucker in every movie. A dorky white dude with incompetent charm that bumbles his way through life. Now, this is not strictly inaccurate to Scott in the comics. He is dorky, a loser, and incompetent. But it glosses over a key part of his character, which is that Scott Pilgrim is kind of a f***ing asshole. Now, I'm not saying that Scott in the movie is a perfect human being. He's not. He's far from it. But they do definitely dial back some of his traits to make him more palatable to general audiences. For one, his age is brought down from 23 to 22, and Knives' age is brought up from 17 to barely 18 in the movie. I believe to make the age gap smaller and less weird to general audiences, but he's still dating a high schooler, which is still gross and weird, but I guess the smaller age gap makes it less weird? Not really. Aside from that, Scott also punches Kim's high school boyfriend in the face out of jealousy, uses Wallace's credit card to pay for lunch with Ramona, shows no remorse for his actions, and no intention to better himself. In fact, a lot of the time, he's actively avoiding it. And those last two are really embodied by Negascott in the comics, which we'll get to later, but that's one of my big beefs with the movie. Now, Scott's not actively trying to be an asshole. He's not intentionally a dickhead, but he still is one. In contrast, Scott in the movie is often painted as a victim, the relatable Hollywood stereotype of dude down on his luck. Mix that with Michael Cera's reputation for playing the same motherfucker in every movie, and you can see where the issues are starting to arise. Now, at a surface level, the comics do the same thing until you get to chapter 34, where Scott's entire perspective is challenged. During a little wilderness retreat, Scott and Kim are out in the woods, and Kim reminds Scott that his little interaction with her high school boyfriend doesn't go how he remembers it. In Scott's mind, he's reimagined this whole scenario as a heroic intervention and rescuing Kim. But no, he was a jealous little prick being a dickhead about it. In embracing the truth of these memories, Scott is now faced with his greatest enemy, himself. So, on the surface, movie Negascott and comic Negascott serve the same function, a dark mirror for Scott to look at himself in. Unlike in the comics, movie Negascott just appears with very little context. We see Knives and Ramona and Scott beating the ever-loving fuck out of Gideon Graves, and as they celebrate their supposed victory, Negascott rocks up. So Scott acknowledges that this is a challenge he needs to take on his own. And then we cut to him walking out with Negascott being all buddy-buddy, and
He's just a really nice guy. We're gonna get brunch next week.
which just undermines kind of the whole point. This gag is emblematic of a lot of my problems with the movie, that the emotional maturity comes way, way down to simplify the story and paint Scott as just kind of a nice guy. The core lesson that Scott learns in the movie is different to what the comics were building towards. And so we come to my biggest issue, that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World uses O'Malley's story and framework to teach a different lesson. And that's where it misses the mark. Wright's adaptation goes for a pretty common story. The downtrodden dude learns to stand up for himself instead of finding motivation in romantic pursuits. one we've heard a million times before. On the flip side, O'Malley's original story is a little bit about that, but more about being a less shitty person. Like I said earlier, Scott's a fucking asshole. He dates a high schooler, cheats on said high schooler, shows no remorse for cheating on said high schooler, and no indication that he intends on changing this sort of behavior. In fact, if anything, Scott is intentionally avoiding change a lot of the time, like prolonging his breakup with Envy, because even though he didn't like the person that she had become, he didn't want the relationship to end either. But it's not just Scott that started back with the movie. Ramona is more of a dickhead in the comics too. She only starts dating Scott because she feels guilty for running a subspace highway through his head without his consent. Not hot. She also refuses to tell Scott her age until they've been dating for several months, and also doesn't mention the whole 7 evil exes thing until after the fight with Matthew Patel. The list goes on, but that sort of behavior is the point. They're both selfish people hurting each other and the other people in their lives. And the direction that the comics go, you see Scott become a better person. Now, that's not to say that Scott is a good person by the end of the series, but he's actively engaging with his mistakes to move forward in his life in a positive way. Scott and Ramona acknowledge that they both did shitty things to each other, and the comics leave off with both of them choosing to give their relationship another shot with their best foot forward. I can already hear you saying that the movie has the same ending, and it does, but it's missing all the context that builds up to that conclusion feeling deserved and earned. Scott's arc in the movie feels rushed, honestly. His apologies come out quick and fast throughout the third act and just feel very hollow. Now, does this make the movie bad? No. It's still a fun, enjoyable movie. It's got some gorgeous art and some banger music going for it, so it's still a great experience. But I do feel like emotionally it has a lot of shortcomings compared to the source material it was adapted from. So with everything that I've discussed now, I think you can start to understand why I describe the comics as the more mature of the two versions of Scott Pilgrim. So finally, we get to probably the reason that this video's ended up in your feed. Scott Pilgrim is getting a Netflix adaptation very, very soon, if I post this video on time. Otherwise, it's already out and you've probably already watched it. Anyway, I just want one thing. One thing. Scott Pilgrim needs to be an oblivious, self-centered asshole with no inclination to change. The entire resolution of the comic series really relies on Scott being a shitty person to begin with and seeing him become less shitty, and the movie doesn't really reach the same conclusion. And so I think with the extended runtime of the Netflix series, having it be multiple episodes means that we get a bit more breathing room. I hope that they can develop that further. But for now, I think that's all I've got to say about Scott Pilgrim. Until I watch the anime and have some issues with that, that's a separate video. Until next time, try not to think about death and get sad and stuff.